All right, y'all. Here's the next 3 chapters. We're going to do them all at once because it's kind of a package that neatly fits together here. We have the Illusion of Nothing as the 2nd chapter in the book. That we're going to show that nothing is a linguistic artifact. Then we have the logical elimination of infinite regress, which is where we arrive once we prove without a doubt that nothing is an illusion and existence is necessary. From the logical elimination of the infinite regress, we arrive in a persistent present moment. Okay? There's no past, there's no future, there's no timeline. Everything is in exist or no exist. And that's it. There's no flowing river where there's the present, here's the future, and here's the past. This is a no-no. That doesn't exist. Because what used to make up the past now makes up the present. What's going to make up the future is going to be using what's in the present at that time. We're always arriving at the present, no matter what. So these are pretty interesting chapters. They land us into the spectrum of consciousness. Then it's contingency guillotine, where we deal with the objective morality. And then we frame morals within a deterministic framework and deterministic moral forces. So, thanks again. I also want to mention as soon as I get Existential Logicism fully up, I'm going to go through and show the derivations of the first 4 equations fully, completely derived. Probably do one video at it, one equation per video. But on the first one, we're going to go through how exactly the UEFT discovery happened and how the persistent present led to that discovery. That discovery led to the natural follow-ons that came with the next 10 equations and more. I want to make it very clear. This is just the surface level intro to what's cracking. This is all thoroughly done out in math. we're good to go. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that, but thanks again. Love y'all.
It's something. One of the oldest philosophical riddles asks, why is there something rather than nothing? This question assumes that nothingness is a legitimate possibility, a state that reality could have been. In this chapter, we dismantle that assumption. We will show that nothing is not an ontological alternative at all, but a conceptual placeholder, a linguistic sleight of hand and cognitive mistake. There never was, and never could be, a state of absolute nothingness. Existence is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever could be. To see why, we must examine of the nothing concept in language and mind, the psychological sources of our fascination with nothingness, especially in fears of death, and, in negation, the lessons of modern physics about empty space, and the logical paradoxes that arise when we try to treat nothing as real. By the end, nothingness will be unmasked as an illusion that has subtly pervaded theology and science, but one that cannot withstand rigorous scrutiny. The linguistic mirage of nothing. Language seduces us into believing in nothing as if it were something. We use the word nothing as a noun, the subject of sentences, which tricks us into thinking it references an entity. For example, when someone says there is nothing in the box, the grammar suggests nothing is in the box, as if nothing were a mysterious occupant. In reality, the sentence means no thing is in the box. The word nothing here doesn't name a thing at all, it indicates an absence. Yet by functioning as a grammatically countable noun, nothing creates a mirage of existence. This linguistic quirk was noted in philosophical analysis. An article about nothing can mean either an article about no thing, no particular subject, or an article about nothing treating nothing as a subject in its own right. The latter reading is misleading. It reifies an absence into an object. A habit of turning nothing into a noun leads to contradictions if taken literally. To even speak of nothingness is to make it into something in thought or language. Philosophers have long warned of this trap. Parmenides, in the 5th century BCE, argued that non-existence cannot be meaningfully spoken or thought of. Thou canst not recognize not being, nor couldst thou speak of it, for thought and being are the same thing. In other words, to think at all is to think of something. To speak of nothing as if it were something is to deny the very meaning of nothingness. To predicate anything of nothingness, to call it vast, empty, ineffable, or any other attribute, is immediately self-contradictory, since nothingness, by definition, has no qualities without turning into a kind of something. Much philosophical mischief arises from failing to notice this linguistic sleight of hand. The word nothing is a useful convenience in grammar. It allows us to talk about absences succinctly, but when we take the word too seriously, we end up imagining an actual condition called nothingness. In truth, nothing is not a thing, and treating it as one is a mistake of language. As Victor Hugo memorably wrote, there is no such thing as nothingness. Nothing is nothing. He was poetically making the same point. Nihilism, the belief in an ontological nothing, has no substance. We will see this more clearly by looking at how our minds handle absence and negation. Cognitive roots. Absence as a thing. Why do we even conceive of nothing in the first place? Part of the answer lies in our cognitive and perceptual experience of absence. Human minds evolved to navigate a world of things, but they also had to register when something sought is not there. We have experiences of nothing in a pragmatic sense. For instance, when you reach into your pocket expecting your keys and find nothing, or when a loved one dies and you feel the absence of their presence. Such experiences are real, but notice what they truly are: experiences of expectation unfulfilled, or of something once present no longer present. The absence is always defined relative to an anticipated presence. You expected keys, but there were none. You once had your loved one alive, now you do not. The feeling of nothing is actually the feeling of loss or lack against a background of somethingness. Cognitive science shows that recognizing an absence is a sophisticated feat of the mind. A striking example is the development of object permanence in infants. In the first few months of life, babies behave as if things that disappear from view have ceased to exist. Out of sight, out of existence describes their world. If you hide a toy, a very young infant will not search for it. To their undeveloped mind, it's simply gone. In psychologist Jean Piaget's classic findings, it's only around 8 to 12 months of age that infants grasp that unseen objects still exist. Before this cognitive milestone, the infant's world blinked out anything not currently sensed, a naive form of treating absence as total non-being, as object. Permanence solidifies. The child learns that reality doesn't evaporate when not observed. This developmental journey is telling. The mind initially struggles with the concept that things persist. Once it overcomes that, the child no longer thinks the toy has become nothing. They understand it's just hidden. In effect, we are all born with a fleeting illusion of nothingness, assuming unseen equal to non-existent, that we quickly outgrow. Even as adults, our brains can be fooled by absences. We perceive holes, shadows, and silences, and often treat them as if they were positive entities. A hole in a donut appears to be a distinct thing. We can point to it, measure it, yet a hole is not an independent object, only an absence of dough. Philosophers note that holes are ontologically parasitic. They only exist in something else and cannot exist in isolation. You cannot have a hole without a surrounding donut or ground or medium. A world consisting solely of holes is impossible. The same is true of shadows, absence of light, or silence, absence of sound. We talk about these absences as if they had their own being. The silence was deafening, a dark shadow moved, but these phrases are convenient fictions of language and perception. The shadow moves only because an object blocking light moved. The silence deafens only in contrast to expected noise. In reality, a shadow is just where light isn't, and a silence is where sound isn't. Yet our minds assign a kind of ghostly substance to these negations, a cognitive quirk that can be called an absence as entity bias. This bias extends to abstract thinking. Consider the concept of zero in mathematics, a symbol for nothingness countable as a number. The invention of zero was revolutionary precisely because it allowed us to treat none as a number, manipulating it like a something. Yet zero's status was philosophically and psychologically perplexing. Ancient cultures struggled with it. The Greeks and Romans, for example, had no numeral for zero. Medieval Europeans were suspicious of the concept when it arrived from Arabic mathematics. The Italian city of Florence even banned zero for a time in the 13th century, as it was thought to invite fraudulent bookkeeping. Why such resistance? Perhaps because zero, nothing challenged the comfortable notion that numbers count things. How can no thing be a number? Eventually, zero was accepted as an abstract placeholder, not because nothingness had become more real, but because we recognized the utility of marking an absence quantitatively. Even today, understanding zero has a cognitive cost. Studies in numerical cognition suggest that thinking about none piggybacks on our ability to perceive absence in sets. In short, our brains can represent nothing in a variety of contexts, whether seeing a missing object, sensing a gap, or using the number zero, but in each case, this representation is parasitic on something else, an expected object, a surrounding context, or a counting framework. The mind never truly grasps nothing on its own terms. It always smuggles in a background of somethingness against which the nothing defined is. This insight hints that nothingness is not a fundamental intuition, but a derivative notion. We derive it by mentally taking something and removing it, then contemplating the leftover void. But the void is never truly void. It inherits meaning from whatever was removed. Try for a moment a simple exercise. Imagine absolute nothingness. Try to picture in your mind the total absence of being. No world, no self, no space or time, utter non-existence. What do you experience? Most likely, you still experience something, perhaps a black emptiness, a blank expanse, or a sense of floating in a dark space. But blackness is a colour, or the presence of unperceived light. Emptiness is still a spatial idea. A blank is still a concept. The human brain cannot present to consciousness an image of pure nothingness. There's no content present. Even the attempt to imagine nothing tends to produce something, however vague or abstract. This psychological fact underscores Parmenides' ancient point: you can't truly think nothing. The moment you try, it becomes something in your mind, even if just a conceptual negation. Thus, from both developmental evidence and introspective truth, what we call nothing is a mental shadow cast by something, a shadow that we can mistakenly treat as substantial if we're not careful. Death, negation, and the illusion of the void. Our conceptual error of treating absence as entity is compounded by emotional and existential factors. Foremost among these is death. Human beings uniquely understand their own mortality, and many traditions describe death as a passage into nothingness, the end of one's existence or experience. This idea can be terrifying. One imagines falling into a void of non-being, a null state where the self is annihilated. The fear of being nothing or of nothingness after death has haunted minds for millennia. But here we must carefully distinguish reality from imagination. What is it actually like to experience nothingness? The honest answer is, it's not like anything at all, because when you are nothing, you aren't there to experience it. This is the insight of the Epicurean tradition in ancient philosophy. As Epicurus famously wrote, death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not, and when death exists, we are not. We never actually encounter our own non-existence. There is no point at which a person perceives I am now no more. The state of not existing is not a state for the person who died. It's only a notion for those still alive, observing that the person is gone. The person themselves simply isn't, and thus cannot suffer or lament the nothingness of death. Yet our imaginations betray us. We project ourselves into a post-mortem void and shudder, as if we would be trapped in a black abyss for eternity. This is a powerful illusion, a kind of mental self-contradiction where we conceive of being there to witness our own absence. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out a related fallacy. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. The end of consciousness is never part of one's conscious content. Thus, nothingness in the personal, existential sense is never actually experienced. It's inferred and feared as an unknown. Our fear treats it as a something, a dark blank where we imagine being dead. But this is as illusory as imagining what it was like before we were born. We might picture a void or darkness before our birth, but who was there to witness that? No one. It's a non-situation. Negation, in general, tends to create these cognitive illusions. Consider how, when we use negation in language, it's not, nothing, nowhere, our minds often momentarily invoke the thing denied. If we say unicorns do not exist, we must first have an idea of a unicorn to negate. If someone says I feel nothing, they're implicitly referencing feelings they could have had. Every negation is conceptually tethered to a positive content. This is why absent and negative concepts can feel real to us. We can't say nothing is here without imagining the here and what it means for it to be empty. In logic, nothing exists is just a shorthand for all X does not exist, a sweeping negation of any entity. But notice that logic cannot have a constant or object named nothing without running into contradictions.
Already?
X does not exist, a sweeping negation of any entity. But notice that logic cannot have a constant or object named nothing without running into contradictions. Properly speaking, nothing is an operator on other concepts denying their existence, not an object itself. These observations reinforce that nothingness is always parasitic on somethingness. We come up with the idea of nothing by taking a bit of reality and mentally nullifying it. The zero and the void are like whole concepts in our mental fabric, defined by surrounding somethings. No wonder then that absolute nothingness, conceived as a standalone reality, slips through our fingers. It is a concept that always points to something else, the thing that isn't there, never to itself. The illusion of the void, that there could be, even theoretically, nothing, owes much to our fears and acts of negation. We dread being nothing, or we speak of nothingness in grand terms, but these are ultimately fantasies born of language and emotion. They do not denote an actual ontological possibility, physics and the quest for empty space. For a long time, humans wondered whether empty space, a total vacuum, is possible in nature. Aristotle argued that a true void cannot exist. Nature abhors a vacuum, believing that emptiness would undermine the coherence of the physical world. Later, scientists proved we can have vacuums in the practical sense, for example, suction pumps removing air from a chamber. By the 17th century, the existence of void space between particles or celestial bodies became an accepted part of physics. It might have seemed that nothingness had a place, the empty vacuum, between stars or the inside of an evacuated bell jar could be thought of as tiny pockets of nothing. However, as physics has advanced, even the vacuum has dissolved into something. Modern quantum theory reveals that what we call empty space is teeming with activity and structure. Even if you remove all matter, all particles, and all radiation from a region, it still isn't nothing. Quantum fields permeate every inch of space, and they can never be completely switched off. The vacuum state in quantum field theory is not an empty box, but a field configuration, the lowest energy state of something. It has fluctuations. Particles can momentarily flicker into existence as virtual pairs. Energy fields can oscillate. Experiments have demonstrated tangible effects of vacuum energy, such as the Casimir effect, where two close metal plates experience an attractive force because certain vacuum field modes are excluded between them. To put it simply, the vacuum has energy, and energy, as Einstein showed, is equivalent to mass, E equal to mc2. So an energetic vacuum is far from nothing, it is a real physical entity with measurable properties. As one analysis puts it, if vacua have energy that can produce particles, then calling a vacuum empty is a misnomer. To say a vacuum has energy denies that it is truly empty. Unsurprisingly, many physicists revel in the idea that the vacuum is far from empty. This modern understanding has led some scientists to claim that physics has answered the question, why is there something rather than nothing, by showing how nothingness is unstable, how quantum nothing inevitably produces something. Notably, physicist Lawrence Krauss titled his book A Universe from Nothing and argued that given quantum laws, universes can spontaneously pop into being from empty space. Stephen Hawking likewise argued that given the law of gravity, the universe could create itself from nothing, but we must examine these claims carefully. What do they mean by nothing? In truth, these physicists are not describing a state of absolute non-existence, they are describing the quantum vacuum or a similar foundational physical law and calling that nothing. Philosophers were quick to point out that this is a bait and switch. The nothing of Krauss or Hawking is actually a something, a rich, law-governed structure ripe with potentiality. As the philosopher David Albert famously critiqued, relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum states, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. None of these poppings of particles in the vacuum amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. In other words, calling the quantum vacuum nothing is like calling a fist, nothing but moving fingers. It misses the point that the fingers' fields are themselves something. The only true nothing in physics would be the absence of all fields, all laws, all potential, a state with no space, time, matter, or energy whatsoever. And physics does not deal with such a state because there's no evidence it ever existed or could exist. It's literally not a state that any physical theory can capture, since physics, by definition, describes something, the way energy and matter behave. Cosmology, when tracing the origin of the universe, often talks about the universe emerging from an extremely hot, dense point, the Big Bang. Does it say it came from nothing? The honest answer is that standard Big Bang cosmology stops at the first fraction of a second. It describes how the early universe expanded and cooled, but it doesn't tell us what, if anything, preceded that or what caused it. Some theoretical models speculate about a quantum fluctuation triggering the Big Bang or a tunneling from a prior state. But again, those models presuppose a quantum state or prior cosmos of some sort, not absolute nothingness. The phrase universe from nothing in popular science is usually shorthand for universe from a vacuum governed by physics, which, as we've established, is not truly nothing. As a result, modern physics actually reinforces the idea that something is fundamental. Even a vacuum is a sea of fields, even a void has space-time structure. The old image of empty space as literally nothingness has vanished. Ironically, Aristotle's intuition that nature abhors a vacuum seems true at the deepest level. There is no complete void, only a plenum of fields and possibilities. Every experiment and observation we have ever made has always found something. If not matter, then energy. If not energy, at least space and time. If not even space-time, which we've never observed absent, at least the presence of logical laws or mathematical structure. No observation has ever produced a true nothing, nor could it, for if nothing were observed, there'd be no observer or observation. The very act of observing requires that something exists, an observer, a detector, etc. So, empirically, nothing is a hypothesis we can never confirm. Reality gives us no reason to think that absolute nothingness is even a coherent option. The paradox of nothingness. We have approached nothingness from language, mind, and physics, and everywhere we find it to be a will-o'-the-wisp. Now we can summarize the logical paradoxes that arise when people try to treat nothing as real. First and foremost, to define nothing is to refute it. The moment we say nothing is such and such, we've implicitly made it into a something with properties, undermining its own definition. If you say nothing exists, you assert that there is a state of affairs, the existence of nothing. But that very statement contradicts itself, since the state of affairs would be something. It's akin to the liar paradox of ontology. The only way nothing exists could be true is if it's not true, because if it is true, then something, the truth of that statement, exists. A world in which nothing is true cannot include the truth of that very claim. Likewise, a reality of absolute nothingness cannot include the fact of its own nothingness. In this sense, nothingness as a total state is logically incoherent. There is no internally consistent way to posit absolute non-being. This aligns with a venerable principle often phrased in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing, nothing comes. Philosophers and theologians throughout history have invoked this axiom to say that you cannot get something out of nothing without remainder. If there were ever truly nothing, it would still be nothing now, since nothingness has no potential, no hidden gears that could start turning to generate existence. The fact that something exists, indeed a whole universe of somethings, implies that an absolute void was never the case. Parmenides drilled this point home over 2,000 years ago, for never shall this be proved, that the things that are not are. Non-existence cannot actually be, only being is. He concluded that being is eternal and ungenerated, because nothing can neither give rise to, nor even be meaningfully thought of as a real state. In plainer terms, there simply is no alternative to existence. Nothingness isn't a viable counterstate, it's a pseudo-idea we get by imagining the subtraction of all specific things, but it is not itself a concrete reality. Even the question, why is there something rather than nothing, might be logically improper. We can certainly rephrase it as, why does this particular universe exist, and not no universe at all, which sounds sensible. Yet, if no universe at all is an impossibility, the question answers itself. There is something because nothing was never possible. Some philosophers have suggested exactly that. For instance, one rejoinder to the famous question is, why not? Why shouldn't there be something? After all, if truly nothing existed, there'd be no laws, no logic, no constraint to prevent something from existing, but also no mechanism to allow it. The question often sneaks in a sense that nothingness is the natural default and something the oddity needing explanation. But if nothingness is self-defeating, then existence is the only option, and the demand to explain existence over nothing is like asking, but why aren't 2 and 2 making 5 instead of 4? It presumes a false counterfactual. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, some thinkers argue we should start where we are, with existence, rather than assume an empty world as a default, because if we start from absolutely nothing, we lack the bearings needed to navigate forward. Trying to begin an explanation from nothing is like trying to build a house on an absence. You can't get started. In fact, any explanation or reason we give is itself something, a thought, a law, a cause, so explanation inherently belongs to the realm of existence. Asking for an explanation of existence in terms of non-existence is a fundamentally ill-posed request. There is also a statistical or metaphysical argument some have made that nothing is just one possibility among infinitely many something possibilities, and thus it's actually more likely that something exists. Imagine all the different ways reality could be, countless types of universes or sets of laws. Among these, absolutely nothing is presumably only one unique case, and arguably not even a valid case. So if one were randomly picking a reality, the odds of hitting exactly the nothingness state are essentially 0. This tongue-in-cheek argument, nurtured by philosopher P. van Inwagen, flips the intuition that nothing is simpler. Sure, the description nothing exists is a short phrase, but the reality of something is robust and self-sustaining, whereas nothing cannot actualize itself. Ultimately, whether through logic or through probability, we come to see that nothingness cannot stand on its own feet. It is either internally contradictory, or at best an empty description with no explanatory power. Theological and scientific myths of nothingness. The illusion of nothingness has also crept into theological and scientific storytelling, where it can cause confusion. In some religious narratives, especially within classical theism, it is said that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. This has often been misunderstood to imply that at some primordial moment there was only nothingness, and then God somehow conjured existence into being. Critics pounce on this. How can something come from nothing? But here it's important to parse the intended meaning. The theological doctrine of creatio ex nihilo was historically meant to deny that God fashioned the world out of some pre-existing material or primordial chaos. It wasn't asserting that nothing was a state that preceded creation. Rather, it says God's creative act didn't use any prior stuff. If one takes it incorrectly, as once there was only nothing, and then the universe appeared, one faces the problems we've outlined. Indeed, so do theologians. They would have to answer how even God could operate on absolute non-being. Most theologians avoid this by contending that God is eternal, so there was never a state where literally nothing at all existed, God at least, was there, or by saying that time itself began with creation, so it's meaningless to talk of before creation when nothing was. In effect, a careful theist does not truly affirm a state of absolute nothingness. They always have God, or God's power, as the something that brings forth other things. Thus, when properly understood, creation from nothing still posits existence divine before physical existence. The nothing is not an ontological reality, it's the absence of material precedent. If, on the other hand, someone were to insist that absolutely nothing, no God, no laws, truly nada, existed, and then the universe popped out, that person would be asserting an absurdity that no classical theology defends. It would be far more damning to the idea of God, because it would eliminate even God from the equation and violate ex nihilo nihil fit. In scientific cosmology, similar care is needed. Phrases like the universe came from nothing make for provocative headlines, but, as we discussed, they rely on redefining nothing. When physicist Stephen Hawking said, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, he smuggled in the law of gravity as a precondition. Remove that law, remove the entire framework of physics, and his statement would have nothing to latch onto. A law of nature is not nothing, it's a regularity or rule that is part of the furniture of existence. In fact, Hawking's statement unintentionally underscores our thesis: given something a law of gravity, something a universe can arise. But he never truly dealt with the case of no law, no space, no time at all. Nor could he, since that's outside the scope of science. Likewise, cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin has spoken of the universe tunneling into existence from nothing. But upon inspection, this nothing is a quantum vacuum of some sort governed by a metastable potential. It's not the absolute void of non-being. These scientific models, fascinating as they are, ultimately do not escape the circle of existence. They merely push the question one level back to why is there a law or a vacuum rather than nothing, a question which remains either philosophical or meaningless. The key point is, whether in theology or cosmology, whenever nothingness is invoked as a starting point, it either is not truly nothing, something else is actually there under another name, or it is an error. Every creation story needs a seed. In religious terms, that seed is God's will, or word. In scientific terms, that seed might be a quantum fluctuation or a prior state. But a seed cannot come from zero seeds. The urge to say first there was nothing, then something is usually a storytelling device to highlight the marvel of creation, not a literal ontological description. We must be careful not to let poetry or metaphor trick us into imagining that nothing had some kind of being. Even those inclined to believe in a divine creation can agree that at least one thing, God, must be eternal, hence reality never bottomed out to nullity. And those who prefer a secular view might posit an eternal multiverse or self-caused universe, again meaning there was always something. In either case, the total void is avoided because it cannot produce anything. Conclusion: existence undefeated. We began with the suspicion that nothingness might be an illusion, and we have traversed a landscape of arguments and evidence to confirm it. Nothingness fails as a concept on every count, linguistically, cognitively, physically, and logically. It is not a genuine ontological state, but a shadow cast by our language and imagination when we consider the absence of particular things. Like a mirage, it disappears upon close inspection. There is always some substrate, some context, some observer or concept that unmasks nothing as in fact something. We find that whenever we think we've found nothing, we have only found a gap between things or a placeholder in a system of somethings. This conclusion has profound implications. It means that existence is the only reality. Being is an absolute that has no negation. In other chapters, we arrive at a similar insight from different angles. In the epistemic refutation paradox, we discovered a foundation of certainty in existence, the realization that one cannot coherently doubt the existence of everything, for the act of doubt itself presupposes an existent doubter. In the persistent present, well, see that only the present moment truly exists in time. The past and future are not independent entities, only records and anticipations in the present. Now, in the illusion of nothingness, we have closed the remaining escape hatch for non-being. There is no timeless void, no alternate reality of nothing that ever was or ever will be. Existence is all there is. It is continuous, unbroken, and ever-present. Even what we call empty time or empty space is filled with the fact of being, if not material being, then the being of fields, laws, or at least the being of logic and truth. By dismantling the notion of nothingness, we also dismantle certain existential fears and confusions. We need not worry about some oblivion outside of reality that might overtake us, because no such oblivion exists. Death is not a transition into nothingness, it is simply the end of the process of an individual life. The atoms and energy that constituted you remain in existence, and the information that was you ceases to be organized in a conscious form. There is no realm of nothingness that swallows you. There is only they, continuation of existence in other forms, minus the form that was you. Likewise, in cosmology, we can be assured that questions of ultimate origins must seek something, a cause, a prior state, a fundamental law, rather than appealing to an impossible null. And in our philosophy, we can confidently assert that reality has no opposite. Being is a tautology unto itself. It is, because it is. To say nothing is real is truly a contradiction in terms. At this point, we can retire the phantom of nothingness. The door is definitively closed on the idea that nothing could have been the case or could ever be achieved. Every road we travel in reasoning, we find existence at the start, middle, and end. As Augustine advised, we started in the middle, where we find ourselves in an existent world, and we see that there was no beginning in nothing and no end in nothing. Existence is victorious by default. It admits no alternative. This realization is a cornerstone of existential logicism. It tells us that any philosophy or worldview must work within the fact of being. We cannot appeal to nothingness for salvation, fear, or explanation. We are faced with the positive reality of something at all times, and that is a liberating truth. Having banished the illusion of nothingness, we reinforce our foundation, the universe we study, the life we live, the thoughts we think. All of it exists in the domain of being and cannot slip into non-being. In the chapters that follow, we will build on this secure ontological footing. We have a world of something to explore, and no phantoms of nothingness will distract us from understanding the nature of that something. The path ahead lies in examining the various modes and structures of existence. Now that we know existence is the only game in town, the void has been vanquished. What remains is to understand the plenitude of being with clarity and logic. In the end, nothingness was much ado about nothing, and now we can move on, firmly rooted in what is. Now that we've dismantled the illusion of nothingness, it's time to confront a closely related impossibility, infinite regress, and make way for a persistent present. Logical elimination of the infinite regress. Something can't come from absolute nothing, but I'm pretty sure the guy who just flipped me off is real, so... In this chapter, we will demonstrate that an infinite regress is not just impractical, it is logically incoherent and metaphysically impossible. Any system that permits an endless chain of causes or justifications ultimately collapses into absurdity, never arriving at a stable foundation. To simply reject infinite regress as undesirable is not enough. We must establish why it is impossible and what necessarily replaces it as a foundation of reality. The logical elimination of infinite regress is not an isolated conjecture, but the inevitable consequence of the prior 3 chapters. The epistemic refutation paradox, ERP, the persistent present, PP, and the illusion of nothingness, ION. Together, these pillars show that an infinite regress of explanations or causes is not merely unlikely or impractical. It is a metaphysical non-starter. In other words, any valid explanatory system must terminate in something self-sufficient and necessary. We will explore each of these 3 insights in turn, and then address major objections before articulating the profound implications of this conclusion. ERP and layer. The limits of knowledge. ERP established that all reasoning and knowledge ultimately depend on self-evident truths or necessary principles. In epistemology, this is known as the regress problem. Every belief or claim would require another belief as justification, and that one would require another, and so on ad infinitum. If an infinite regress of justification were possible, a view some epistemologists call infinitism, genuine knowledge could never get off the ground. Every justification would forever defer to a prior justification, and nothing would ever be truly justified. In practical terms, if every reason needs another reason to support it, we would be stuck in an eternal chain of why. Questions with no final answer. This is clearly a vicious regress. It fails to resolve the very problem grounding knowledge that it sets out to solve. Since we do have knowledge, infinite justification chains cannot be the whole story. At some point, the chain of reasons must terminate in something foundational. In classical terms, this is often handled by foundationalism, which posits that there are basic beliefs or self-justifying truths that require no further support. ERP confirms that without at least one self-evident starting point, the entire edifice of knowledge collapses. Thus, knowledge cannot exist within an infinite sequence of unsupported inferences. It needs a starting point that does not itself demand justification. That starting point cannot be arbitrary or contingent, or else it would beg the question, why that point? And the regress would sneak in again at a deeper level. Instead, the foundation of knowledge must be a necessary truth, something that is true by its very nature and justifies itself. In the context of our inquiry, ERP revealed that the undeniability of immediate experience serves as such a starting point. A truth, for example, experience is occurring, that cannot be coherently doubted and does not rely on a prior proof. More generally, ERP teaches us that any knowable system of thought requires a terminus of justification, a self-grounded principle. Without it, the concept of truth or knowledge would evaporate into an infinite mire of uncertainty. The lesson of ERP is clear. An infinite regress of reasons is impossible if we are to avoid total epistemic nihilism. Some truths must stand firm on their own necessity for anything else to be known. The persistent present, eliminating infinite causal chains, the persistent present PP argument, shows that time and causality, much like knowledge, cannot sustain an infinite regress. We normally think of time as a succession of moments stretching into the past and future, but PP embraces presentism, the view that only the present moment truly exists. Every moment we encounter is the now, continuously renewed. Past moments have happened and are gone, future moments are yet to be and have no reality now. If an infinite regress of causes were true, the present moment could never be reached. It would be eternally trapped behind an infinite sequence of prior events that had to happen first. To illustrate this, philosophers often use the analogy of counting down from negative infinity. If the universe had an infinite past, it would be like someone attempting to finish counting an infinite series of negative numbers in order to reach 0, the present. They would never succeed, because no matter how far back they start, an infinity of numbers would still precede any given point. If the past were truly infinite, today would never arrive. The countdown of all prior events would never conclude. And yet, the present has arrived. We are here now, experiencing this moment. This undeniable fact refutes the notion of an infinite temporal regress in causation. The chain of events leading to the present cannot extend endlessly backward. It must have a fundamental resolution point or a first cause or condition that allows the sequence to start and proceed. Historically, this is one insight behind the cosmological argument for a first cause. Importantly, PP refines this insight by noting that the resolution point need not be a first moment in time in the classical sense, some initial tick of the cosmic clock. Rather, what is required is a necessary principle or state that enables each moment to be realized. In other words, instead of a temporal beginning out of nothing, there must be. An underlying equilibrium or creative principle that is eternally present and continuously gives rise to each new moment. Such a principle would ensure that time can unfold without an infinite delay. This means physical reality doesn't require a prior event before all others, which just raises the question of what came before the first. It requires a fundamental ground of being or self-sufficient cause that operates continually to sustain the sequence of events. The persistent present thereby eliminates the need for an infinite causal chain. The existence of this present moment indicates that the causal sequence resolves in something that exists outside the sequence, a necessity that is always present to guarantee that each new event can happen. In sum, an infinite regress of causes is incompatible with the reality of now. There must be a causally self-contained source that allows the succession of moments to commence and continue. Without such a source, time itself would be stuck in an unreachable past, and the fact of the present would be inexplicable. The illusion of nothingness, why an absolute void cannot exist. The illusion of nothingness ion reveals that the very concept of nothingness is incoherent as a state of reality. Philosophers have long asked, why is there something rather than nothing? A question that presumes nothing is a possible default. Ion dismantles that assumption by showing that nothing is not an ontological alternative at all, but merely a placeholder concept in language and thought. We use the word nothing to denote the absence of specific things. For example, there is nothing in the box, meaning no object is present. But we are easily misled into treating nothingness as a kind of background reality. In truth, absolute nothingness cannot exist. It is a logical contradiction. To even speak of nothing is to refer to something, even if only an idea. Thus, the notion of a state in which there is utterly nothing, no space, no laws, no existence whatsoever, is an illusion born of grammar and imagination. As Parmenides observed over 2 millennia ago, non-being is literally unspeakable. You cannot know what is not, nor utter it. Likewise, the poet Victor Hugo put it succinctly, there is no such thing as nothingness. Nothing is nothing. In short, nothingness has no ontological legs to stand on. What does this mean for infinite regress? If an infinite regress of explanations or causes were true, it would imply that existence has no ultimate ground, that it turtles all the way down, with no fundamental entity at the bottom. Carried to its logical end, this suggests that being could dissolve into non-being, that if we chased the chain of dependency forever, we might end up with no cause at all, effectively something arising from nothing. But Ion has shown that nothing is not a valid terminus. Nothingness cannot be the origin of something, not because of a causal prejudice, but because nothingness isn't actually a state that could obtain. Therefore, there never was a state of absolute nothingness in reality. Existence in some form is eternal. We are forced to conclude that something has always existed. However, this eternal something cannot itself be dependent on prior causes, since that would just push the regress back one step. Whatever has always existed must exist by its own nature, requiring no external cause. It must be self-sustaining, self-resolving, and necessary. Ion thus complements the previous arguments. It tells us that the chain of explanation cannot terminate in a void or an arbitrary stop. There is no option of, and then nothing, and that's why something exists. That is nonsense. The only way to end an explanatory regress is in a necessary being or principle that cannot not exist. In metaphysical terms, this is a being whose essence includes existence itself, or a truth that is unavoidably the case. Nothingness, being impossible, cannot be where a regress lands. The regress must end in being, specifically in necessary being. Why infinite regress is impossible, and what must replace it. Taken together, ERP, PP, and Ion paint a coherent picture. Infinite regress, whether in reasoning, causation, or existential origins, cannot be the structure of reality. Rejecting infinite regress is not a mere preference, but a logical necessity. We cannot ground knowledge, causality, or existence upon an infinite chain of dependencies without collapsing the very concepts of knowledge, causality, or existence. Each of the three pillars independently forced us to recognize a terminus, a self-justifying truth in the case of knowledge, a first cause or ever-present source in the case of time, and a necessary being in the case of existence. These conclusions all point to the same idea: reality must have a necessary self-existent foundation that does not require anything prior to it. In fact, it would be contradictory to suppose otherwise. If we try to imagine any domain in which explanations trail off into an infinite regress, we find that domain becomes unintelligible or outright contradictory. Thus, infinite regress is not just untenable, it is impossible in a coherent worldview. The only logically valid solution is that the buck stops at something fundamental that explains itself. Our task now is to confront a few major objections to this line of reasoning in order to see whether rejecting infinite regress is truly unavoidable. Confronting objections, is an infinite regress just reality? Even faced with the above arguments, some will object that perhaps an infinite regress is simply how reality is, bizarre and paradoxical as it may seem. Others propose clever workarounds, like circular causation or brute facts, in an effort to avoid positing a fundamental foundation. Let us address and dismantle the three most common objections. Objection 1, an infinite regress just is the nature of reality. According to this objection, an endless chain of causes or justifications is not a flaw in our explanations, but an inherent feature of existence. On this view, there is no need for a final stopping point or ultimate ground. Reality just is an infinite cascade of dependencies stretching infinitely into the past or downwards in explanation. Instead of seeking a terminator to the chain, this perspective urges us to embrace the regress as the true structure of the world, however counterintuitive it may be. For example, a radical epistemic infinitist might claim that beliefs can be justified by an infinite series of other beliefs with no foundational belief, or a cosmologist might speculate that time extends eternally backward with no beginning. Why not, they ask, simply accept an infinite regress as brute truth? The answer is that this solution is no solution at all. It is an admission of failure to explain. To say it's just infinite all the way, no further justification needed, is to abandon the very aim of reasoning, which is to increase understanding. What does it mean to claim reality is nothing more than an endless chain of unanswered whys. If no fact or event can ever be fully explained or grounded because there's always another layer beneath, then, in a profound sense, nothing is ever explained at all. This stance undermines the possibility of knowledge and understanding. It leaves us in a paradoxical position. If every belief or fact relies on a prior one ad infinitum, then no belief can ever be validated or known for certain. The entire enterprise of knowledge would be like a mirage. Each time you reach for a justification, it slips further out of reach. In accepting an infinite regress, we would be accepting that we can never actually know anything. Every answer is just a deferred question. As one analysis of the regress problem puts it, an infinite regress of this sort renders a theory self-defeating, because it fails to solve the problem it was meant to solve. Knowledge would be impossible in principle, as it would require completing an infinite justification process. This contradicts the fact that we do have some knowledge, even if only of our own immediate experience. Therefore, by reductio ad absurdum, infinite epistemic regress cannot reflect reality. If it did, the very concept of truth or justified belief would implode. We would be trapped in total skepticism, never able to claim any knowledge as established. The same goes for causality. If every event required a prior event ad infinitum, then no event could ever occur. The chain would never start moving. The present moment, as we saw, would be forever out of reach, always waiting for an infinite number of prerequisites to be fulfilled. Yet here we are, in the present, observing events happening. So it cannot be true that every event depends on a prior event with no beginning. Somewhere, somehow, the chain of causation must anchor itself and resolve into a cause that is not itself caused. Denying this leads to a direct contradiction with reality as it is observed. In short, claiming that infinite regress just exists is not a bold theory, it is a surrender to incoherence. It amounts to saying reality ultimately makes no sense, and we are content with that. But philosophy and science are built on the opposite premise, that reality does make sense, and that contradictions signal a mistake in our thinking, not an acceptable feature of the world. Indeed, to philosophize is to refuse to tolerate contradictions. As such, we must reject the notion that an infinite regress of explanations can simply exist as a brute fact of reality. It is an illusory answer that, under scrutiny, annihilates all understanding. Embracing an endless regress would mean giving up on the pursuit of truth, a price far too high, and fortunately one we do not need to pay. Objection 2. What if the universe is an infinite causal loop? A different escape attempt is to replace a linear infinite regress with a circular loop. Rather than A caused by B, B by C, and so on forever, one might suggest that perhaps A causes B, B causes C, and C causes A, closing the chain into a self-contained cycle. This way, the universe, or some aspect of it, might have no ultimate beginning, yet also avoids an infinite linear regress. It loops back onto itself. Such a model is sometimes entertained in cosmology, a universe that recycles itself eternally, or in certain philosophical views of time closed time curves, and might be seen as akin to. In epistemology, beliefs mutually support each other in a web, with no linear hierarchy. On the face of it, this idea of a causally closed loop or self-referential system sounds elegant. It seems to offer a way for the universe to be its own cause without invoking anything beyond the system. Are causal loops a viable alternative to an infinite regress? Closer analysis shows that a causal loop is merely regress in disguise. Making the chain circular doesn't remove the need for explanation, it only obscures it. If we say A causes B, B causes C, and C causes A, we have certainly drawn a neat closed curve, but we haven't actually explained why any of these entities exist or have the powers they do. The entire loop, taken as a whole, still calls for a grounding explanation. To declare it's a loop, therefore it has no external cause, risks treating the loop itself as a magic talisman that somehow generates existence from non-existence. But a cycle of causes is not self-explanatory merely by virtue of being circular. We can ask of the entire loop, why does this loop exist at all, instead of nothing or instead of some other configuration? The loop either has an answer to that or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then we've just pushed the brute fact problem up one level, the entire loop is now the brute fact. If it does have an answer, that answer will amount to a principle or condition outside the loop that makes the loop necessary, in which case the loop wasn't truly self-contained after all. Imagine 3 books that lie in a circle, each one propping up the next. While each book is supported by another, you wouldn't conclude that the books are levitating independently. The question, what holds them up, still rightly points out that the whole set of books needs support, perhaps a table underneath. Likewise, A because B because C because A is an explanatory gestalt that still requires a foundation. Without an external support, the loop is a case of circular reasoning. It provides the illusion of explanation, A because B, etc., but in reality, it explains nothing. It's a closed circle of dependency with no origin. To call such a loop self-caused is to commit a kind of logical sleight of hand. You assume the existence of the whole in order to explain the parts, and assume the parts to explain the whole, but never explain the origin of either. In technical terms, if the loop is considered contingent, that is, it didn't have to exist, and could have been otherwise, then it still begs for an explanation beyond itself. So we're back to regress, just one level up. If instead the loop is considered necessary, existing by necessity of its own nature, then the necessity is really the fundamental explanation, not the looping structure. In that case, we might as well simplify and say there is a necessary foundation, which could manifest as a loop or otherwise, but the looping adds nothing to the explanation. In summary, causal loops do not evade the problem of infinite regress, they merely wrap the regress in a circle. The fundamental issue remains any contingent configuration, even a cyclical one, calls for an explanation of its existence. Without a further reason, the loop is arbitrary and ungrounded. With a further reason, we have introduced a necessary factor outside the loop. Either way, the loop alone cannot be the ultimate answer. We are still driven to acknowledge a self-sufficient principle that gives the loop, or any structure, reality. Thus, infinite causal or explanatory loops fare no better than infinite chains. A loop cannot literally cause itself from nothing, it must be sustained by something more fundamental. And that brings us back to a necessary being or principle once again. The conclusion, causal loops are clever illustrations, but they do not eliminate the need for a final ground. They are, at best, a different way of picturing a system, and at worst, a means of hiding the problem in plain sight without solving it. Objection 3, why not just accept brute facts? Our final objection concedes that perhaps explanations do have to stop somewhere, but it denies that the stopping point must be necessary or self-explanatory. According to this view, some things just exist inexplicably. They are brute facts. A brute fact is something that is true or exists without any reason or cause. It just is. This line of thought suggests that instead of eliminating infinite regress through a logical principle or necessary being, we could simply declare an arbitrary terminus. This exists for no reason, it's just a brute fact, and that's the end of the explanation. For example, one might claim that the universe itself is a brute fact. It exists without cause or explanation. Or similarly, a theist might claim God is a brute fact, eternal and without external explanation. In both cases, the response to why does this exist would be, it just does. Don't ask further. By invoking brute facts, one effectively attempts to stop the regress by fiat, not by reason. Is this move acceptable in philosophy or science? To accept brute facts is to perform an intellectual retreat rather than a resolution. It halts the regress, yes, but at the cost of abandoning the search for understanding. The moment we allow just because as an answer, inquiry loses its power. Declaring something a brute fact is like closing the book on a mystery and saying no solution exists. It is the antithesis of explanation. This approach not only feels unsatisfying, it is deeply problematic for the foundations of rational thought. If we permit one brute fact, what principle stops anything from being a brute fact? If certain features of reality need no explanation, then, in principle, we could use that excuse to shut down any further questioning about anything. Any inconvenient puzzle could be dismissed with, well, that's just how it is. This would collapse philosophy and science into arbitrariness. The scientific enterprise operates on the assumption that phenomena have explanations, that we can find reasons for why things are the way they are, rather than accepting them as random givens. Indeed, the principle of sufficient reason, going back to Leibniz, holds that for anything that exists, there must be a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Brute facts explicitly violate this principle by saying here, there is no reason, as one commentator put it, allowing even a single unexplained fact means the rule, everything has a reason is broken, and if it's broken once, who's to say it won't break everywhere? The expectation of explanation would be undermined across the board. Accepting brute facts would thus inject a kind of chaos into our worldview. The universe would no longer be rationally ordered through and through, but an amalgam of some explainable parts and some inscrutable, just so patches. That undercuts the unity and predictability of reality. We observe, however, that reality does exhibit remarkable order, coherence, and lawfulness. To arbitrarily carve out an aspect of reality and say this part has no reason is inconsistent with the success of reason and science elsewhere. Beyond these epistemic issues, calling something a brute fact doesn't actually answer the question, it just refuses to answer. If someone asks, why does X exist? And we respond, it just does. End of story. We haven't provided understanding, we've halted the conversation. The problem of arbitrariness also looms large. Why that brute fact and not something else? If the universe just exists without reason, why this universe with these laws rather than a completely different one, or none at all? To say no reason is to effectively say it's a random accident. But if reality were ultimately random and irrational at its foundation, it's hard to see why it would exhibit consistent logical structure or any regularity. Yet it does. Invoking brute facts on a broad scale would make the success of scientific and logical reasoning a puzzling miracle. Even those who propose brute facts usually do so selectively. For example, only the Big Bang is brute. Everything after follows laws, or only God is brute. Everything else, he explains. But selective arbitrariness is still arbitrariness. The only coherent way to terminate a regress is with something that by its nature needs no further explanation. That is, something necessary. A necessary fact or being is not brute in the arbitrary sense. It has a built-in reason for its existence. It cannot not exist. In contrast, a brute fact could conceivably be otherwise or not exist, but simply doesn't have an explanation for why it is so. Such brute contingency offers no solace to reason. It fails to answer the regress. It just puts up a sign saying stop. No explanation beyond this point. This goes against the grain of rational inquiry and even basic intellectual curiosity. In short, brute facts are an excuse to avoid the problem, not a solution to it. They undercut the very project of understanding the world. Therefore, we reject brute facts as a cop-out. The terminus of explanation must be something that explains itself by its very nature, something whose existence is anchored in necessity, not something that we arbitrarily declare to exist for no reason. Having dispatched these objections, we find that our original thesis stands. We are logically driven to a worldview in which infinite regress has no place. Neither infinite chains, nor closed loops, nor arbitrary brute facts can ultimately satisfy the demands of reason. The only viable option is a necessary foundation for reality. Implications, the foundation of causal and epistemic structure. Acknowledging that infinite regress is impossible forces a radical but illuminating shift in how we understand reality, knowledge, and explanation. If no chain of explanation can be infinite, then some final stopping point exists, not as a matter of speculative metaphysics, but as a logical requirement. This has far-reaching consequences for both metaphysics, the study of what exists, and epistemology, the study of how we know. First and foremost, if reality does not permit an infinite causal history, then something exists, necessarily. At the core of existence, there must lie a fundamental principle or entity that depends on nothing outside itself. This foundational reality is self-sufficient and non-contingent. In plainer terms, it doesn't wait on anything else to exist. It just is, and cannot be otherwise. All other things, all events, and all truths ultimately derive from this foundation. Crucially, this necessary basis cannot be an arbitrary posit. That would be the brute fact route we've ruled out. It must be there by its own nature, meaning that its non-existence is impossible. We might call it the ground of being or the first principle. Throughout history, various labels have been attached to this idea: God, Tao, logical law, fundamental energy, etc. But whatever it is called, it plays the role of ending the regress with coherence rather than arbitrariness. Everything that exists or is true is anchored, in the final analysis, in this self-grounded reality. To deny the above is to collapse into incoherence. If one insisted, despite all, that there really is no final foundation, that explanations keep going in circles or forever, one would be asserting that nothing ever actually explains existence. The very fact we find ourselves in an ordered world with comprehensible patterns would be a miracle with no rationale. By contrast, accepting a necessary foundation restores intelligibility. It affirms that existence is not a brute accident, nor an infinite riddle with no answer, but a structured system grounded in a principle of reason. For example, one might think of the principle being exists or logic is true as necessarily and eternally the case. This aligns with a deep intuition behind all inquiry that at the bottom of things there is a reason. Indeed, the absence of infinite regress vindicates a strong form of the principle of sufficient reason, that for everything that exists, there is a reason why it is so. Here, the ultimate reason is the nature of the necessary foundation itself. Metaphysically, this means any model of the universe or reality must be restructured to include a necessary element at the base. No cosmological model that relies on an endless sequence of events can be complete. It must account for what made the sequence possible. No theory of physics that posits an infinite regression of energy exchanges or expansions and contractions can be satisfactory without identifying a timeless law or entity that underpins the series. Similarly, in ontology, the study of being, one cannot hold that entities only exist because other entities cause them in an unbroken regress. One must posit at least one entity that exists in virtue of itself. Whether we imagine the foundation to be a law of nature, a logical truth, a state of pure being, or a divine creator, the key attribute is the same. It does not derive its existence from something else. It just is by necessity. Future philosophical and scientific frameworks will be judged, in part, by whether they successfully incorporate this terminus. Any framework that continues to assume an open-ended regress of explanations isn't just incomplete. It is internally defeated by its inability to ever explain anything fully. Epistemologically, the implications are equally profound. It means that knowledge in principle has a secure foundation. Skeptical worries about needing proof for proof for proof and so on are answered by the recognition that some truths prove themselves. For example, the knowledge that I am experiencing something might be such a foundational truth. It cannot be doubted without affirming it. If one is experiencing doubt, that's still an experience. More abstractly, the basic laws of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction, might be candidates for necessary truths. They are presupposed by any act of reasoning, including attempts to deny them. The end of infinite regress assures us that certainty is attainable in at least some domains. We don't slide into total relativism or nihilism because there is a firm ground upon which the structure of thought rests. All inferential knowledge, knowledge that comes via evidence and reasoning, must trace back to non-inferential knowledge at the base, something known by its own light. Thus, our picture of knowledge becomes one of a pyramid or an arch, many levels of beliefs and reasons, but ultimately supported by a few keystones that hold everything up by themselves. Recognizing this undermines extreme skepticism. Yes, we must be critical and demand reasons, but we also acknowledge when a reason is so fundamental that it needs no further support. If we did not, we would be forced to doubt everything and resolve nothing. Thankfully, the elimination of infinite regress means that reason can reach bedrock. We can have confidence that some principles, call them axioms, self-evident truths, or necessary facts, give validity to the whole structure of thought and language. Rational inquiry, then, is not an infinite pendulum never coming to rest. It is more like a finite voyage that, if pursued deeply enough, lands on the unshakable ground of necessity. Another implication concerns reality's structure. If reality must necessary foundation, it follows that reality, the nature of rest, on A is fundamentally ordered and deterministic in a broad sense. By deterministic here, we do not mean that every event is predetermined in a Laplacian clockwork sense, but rather that reality's basic framework is governed by law-like necessity rather than whim or chance. The existence of a necessary principle implies that many features of the world logically follow from or are sustained by that principle. This rules out the idea of a fundamentally random or lawless cosmos. Even probabilistic and chaotic processes, like quantum events or weather patterns, occur against the backdrop of stable laws or conditions that make those very processes possible. The coherence of the world is guaranteed by the necessary foundation. Things exist in a certain way because if they didn't, nothing would make sense or could persist. In a way, this elevates reason itself to a cosmic role. The structure of reality is rational, or at least rationally understandable at its core, because if it weren't, we'd devolve into the absurdities of infinite regress. Thus, we expect that whatever the fundamental principle is, it brings a unity and consistency to the cosmos. This is consonant with the success of physics and mathematics. In describing the universe, deep down there are elegant equations and symmetries, hinting that the world emanates from something like a logical or mathematical necessity. It also resonates with philosophical rationalism, the view that reality is ultimately shaped by reason or intelligible principles. The elimination of infinite regress reinforces why. Reality cannot be an arbitrary assortment of phenomena. It must be a self-contained, logically integrated whole. Otherwise, it would fragment into disjointed facts hanging on nothing. Finally, we should consider the practical intellectual consequence for anyone modelling reality. We now have a sort of litmus test for theories. Does this theory ultimately ground out in something necessary, or does it leave an infinite regress? If the latter, the theory is incomplete or incoherent. For example, a theory in cosmology that posits oscillating universes forever must answer why this eternal cycle. A theory in mathematics that tries to define every concept in terms of more fundamental concepts endlessly will never produce a proof. In contrast, a theory that acknowledges a base, like the axioms of mathematics or a first law of physics, sets the stage for a solid structure. This doesn't mean we should readily accept any proposed foundation. We must rigorously evaluate what candidate could serve as a genuine self-sufficient principle. But it means we won't fear the idea of an ultimate explanation as unscientific or mystical. On the contrary, an ultimate explanation, a terminus of explanation, is demanded by logic. Even if that ultimate explanation is something currently beyond our imagination, we know it must exist. This opens the door to profound questions in metaphysics and theology. What is the nature of the necessary foundation? Is it conscious intelligence, as some theistic philosophers argue the ens necessarium, or necessary being is, or an impersonal set of laws, as some naturalistic philosophers might claim, or perhaps something that transcends those categories? Those debates lie beyond our scope here, but they are the right kind of debates to have, ones that presume a terminus and seek to characterize it, as opposed to debates that try to avoid a terminus altogether. Conclusion. In closing, the elimination of infinite regress is not a negotiable thesis, but a logical mandate. There is no escape from the fact that existence and knowledge require a foundation that stands on its own. Any attempt to explain the world by an endless deferral either results in contradiction, explains nothing, or implicitly smuggles in a hidden foundation, as we saw with loops and brute facts. To construct a meaningful, coherent picture of reality, we must abandon the fantasy that it's explanations all the way down, and recognize that at the heart of everything lies something irreducible, something that simply must be. This isn't a limitation of our imagination, it is a discovery about how reason operates and how being sustains itself. Causality and knowledge must be self-grounded at the root, not infinitely deferred. The very presence of any truth or any event is the proof that the buck stops somewhere. By eliminating infinite regress, we affirm that reality is intelligible and logically ordered. We affirm that contradictions can be resolved and that understanding can reach completion. This clarity comes at the cost of accepting a necessary core to reality, but it is not a cost so much as a revelation. It tells us that contingency and randomness do not have the final word, necessity and coherence do. Infinite regress cannot stand, it destroys the very context needed for things to exist or be known. Necessity is unavoidable, something has to exist by its own power for anything else to exist at all. Logical coherence demands a final grounding, and in finding it, we secure the possibility of knowledge, explanation, and existence itself. In sum, the refusal of infinite regress is the affirmation of intelligibility, a commitment that our search for answers does end in answers, and those answers, in turn, illuminate why there is an end at all. Reality, we conclude, is not an infinite question mark, but a well-founded structure, and that foundation is the ultimate answer to the riddle of why anything at all. The persistent present, the time is now, seriously, it's literally always now and always will be. With the problem of infinite regress behind us, we turn to a hidden assumption that still shapes our view of reality, the belief in time beyond the now. Every moment we experience happens now. The only reality we ever encounter is the present moment, a persistent present that continually renews itself. The persistent present principle in existential logicism holds that the present is all that truly exists, rejecting the common belief of time as a flowing line with a real past behind us and a real future ahead. In this view, past and future are only ideas or conceptual constructs, only the present is ontologically real. Philosophically, this aligns with the idea of presentism, that only present things exist. Past events have happened and are gone, future events will happen but do not exist yet. By fully embracing the ontology of the present, we can resolve paradoxes of time, reframe causality, and clarify the role of consciousness in perceiving time. Why insist that only the present exists? This conclusion arises from several fundamental insights. The first is that nothingness never existed. There was never a state of absolute nothingness from which something had to arise. Existence in some form is eternal and ongoing, always present in one way or another. No infinite past, an infinite regress of prior events is impossible. If an endless chain had to occur before now, the present moment would never arrive. The fact that now has arrived means the chain of causes must terminate in a sustaining reality of the present. Experience is immediate. All experience, and thus all knowledge, occurs now. We have direct access only to the present moment. The past and future reach us only through memory and anticipation in the present. Time is not fundamental, a you-ifed insight. Modern physics hints that time may be an emergent, not fundamental, feature of reality. For instance, the unified equilibrium field theory you-ifed posits that only equilibrium states existing now are physically real, treating time as a derived concept rather than a basic dimension. Causality unfolds. In the now, every cause produces its effect in some present moment. The chain of cause and effect is contained within successive present moments, not spread across an already existent timeline. In short, the present is not just one moment among others, it is the only actual state of reality. Past and future have no independent existence of their own, they are essentially present traces and present expectations. Existence is nothing other than the self-renewing field of the present moment. The illusion of past and future. One of the biggest misconceptions about time is the idea that the past still exists in some form or place, or that the future is somehow already real, just waiting to happen. Intuitively, we tend to picture time as a continuum along which past, present, and future all have some kind of existence. Modern relativistic physics even encourages this picture by treating time as a dimension akin to space, implying all moments might coexist in a block universe. Albert Einstein famously wrote that for those of us convinced by physics, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. In a strict relativistic model, time does not flow. Instead, the universe can be depicted as a static 4D space-time, a frozen block in which every event, past or future, simply is. If one takes that image literally, the past and future would be just as real as the present, and our sense of a moving now would be a trick of consciousness. 94. Existential logicism takes the opposite stance. The real illusion is the belief that past and future exist in addition to the present. In reality, the past has ceased to exist, and the future has not yet come into existence. They're not places we could travel to, or realms that are already there waiting for us. They are labels for states that once existed, or may exist someday. All that is real, all that truly exists, is what is happening right now in the present. As one physicist put it bluntly, the future does not exist. It does not. Ontologically, it's not there. What we call the past is essentially a set of present memories and records, and the future is a set of present expectations or projections. We will never find the past by digging through the universe, nor locate the future in some hidden dimension, because they simply are not real entities. They are ideas, dependent on minds to recall or imagine them. Over 1,000 years ago, St. Augustine recognized this. The time present of things past is memory. The time present of things present is direct experience. The time present of things future is expectation. In other words, the past and future exist for us only as present traces, present memories, records, or present anticipations, never as independent realities. The only actuality is now. Why only now is real? Consider a simple analogy, a wave in the ocean. The wave moves forward, rising and breaking, but it does not carry along a concrete copy of its past shape. The form it had a moment ago no longer exists, only the form it has right now does. The water itself persists, but the particular shape, the wave's crest at time t, is transient. Reality, viewed as a deterministic wave, is similar. The universe's material substance persists, but its form or state is constantly changing in the present. The past form is gone. It has given way to the present configuration of all particles and fields, and the future form hasn't come yet. There is no cosmic archive where past states reside once they have rolled over into new states. At any given moment, the universe is in one specific configuration. That is the present state. A moment later, it will be in another configuration, and that new state is then the present. We often speak as if the past is stored somewhere, as if time were a recording that the universe keeps. But this is a mental habit, not a reflection of physical reality. No master tape of the universe exists outside the present moment. The previous state of the world has been entirely transformed into the current state through the lawful progression of physical causes, and nothing of the past exists now except as influences on the present. Likewise, the future is not sitting in some distant depot waiting for arrival. It must be generated from the present state, and until it happens, it has no reality. Physics supports this dynamic, present-focused view. In quantum mechanics, for example, it has been demonstrated that properties of a system often have no definite value until they are measured in the present moment, famously encapsulated by the phrase reality doesn't exist. Until you measure it, a particle doesn't carry a determined future outcome hidden within itself. Only when an observation forces a result in the present do we get a definite state. This suggests that the future is genuinely open within probabilistic constraints until it crystallizes into a present event. Even in deterministic physics like classical mechanics, the future state is determined in principle by the present conditions and laws, but it is not actual until those conditions evolve into that future state. The distinction here is like the difference between a plan and the outcome. The laws of physics may plan the future by making it predictable, but they do not bring the future into existence ahead of time. The only world that exists is the current one. What will happen is not an existent thing, but rather a result that will be realized when the time comes, and when it comes, it will be a new present. Think of reality not as a movie reel that already has every frame of film existing at once, but as an improvisational live performance. The play is being written as it is performed. Once a line is delivered, it's no longer out there in any tangible form, except insofar as it leaves an influence on later lines. Likewise, lines yet to be spoken do not exist until the actors actually say them. What persists is the acting troupe and the stage, the universe's substance and its laws, not the specific scenes which have come and gone, memory, history and records. If only the present exists, how do we explain our very real sense that the past did happen? Don't our memories and all the historical evidence prove the past's reality? They prove that the past was real, not that it is real now. Memory is a present phenomenon. The brain in the present can store and replay information about former states of the world. But this no more proves the past still exists than a photograph proves the continued existence of its subject. A photo of a city 100 years ago doesn't mean that city from 100 years past still objectively exists. It means light once reflected off that city and left an imprint we can see today. Likewise, your memory of yesterday is a pattern of neural connections and activations in your brain right now. It is a present state of your neurons that carries information about a prior state. The event of yesterday itself is gone. Only a record remains, whether in brain cells, in diaries, or in physical traces like fossils. Those records are all part of the current world. They are present objects, or states that have a certain configuration due to past influences, but none of them is the past itself. To mistake a memory for the past is like mistaking a history book for the actual events it describes. The book is real now, the events are not. The events have happened, and their effects persist, but the events are no longer occurring. As Augustine noted, we essentially carry the past within the present as memory, not as an ongoing reality somewhere else. And remember that memory is notoriously imperfect. It's not a literal re-experiencing of the past, but a reconstruction. This underscores that the past we think we perceive in memory is a present construction, which can be distorted or false. It has no independent existence where it could be directly. Checked, we infer the past's nature only from present clues. Similarly, historical records, documents, photographs, videos, are present artifacts. A video of last year's event is not the event itself playing in some hidden time, it's a sequence of images stored on a medium that we can replay now. All evidence of history lives in the present and must be interpreted by present minds. Thus, nothing about the existence of memories or records contradicts the persistent present existential logicism view. On the contrary, it highlights that everything we know about the past is rooted in the present. There's an interesting irony here. We often think the past is solid and the future unknowable, yet in truth we have no direct access to either. We only have present knowledge, records, memories, traces, and present reasoning, extrapolations, predictions. Past and future are, in a strict sense, ideas and inferences that we form in the present, the continuous unfolding of causality. If only the present exists, what then is time? Rather than an independent flowing substance, or a literal fourth dimension in which we travel, time becomes an emergent concept, essentially the ordering of events by causality. Time is the measure of change between present states. The reason we sense a flow from past to present to future is that our universe obeys laws of cause and effect that produce a sequence of state changes. This sequence creates a before and after structure to events. But that structure doesn't require past and future to coexist with the present. It only requires that present states can give rise to new present states. In other words, time is simply an aspect of the present's evolution. Think of dominoes falling, one knocks over the next. The falling sequence gives a direction, earlier domino versus later domino, but at any given instant, only the domino that is mid-fall exists in that state. Earlier ones have already fallen and come to rest. Later ones have yet to be struck. Similarly, the universe now contains the results of previous events and the seeds of future events. But the previous events themselves are finished, and the future events have not yet happened. This view transforms time from a thing in itself into a useful concept that describes how the present changes. Modern physics often treats time as a coordinate in equations, which can misleadingly suggest that time is like a dimension of space. In Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time are combined in a four-dimensional spacetime, and there is no single universal present. Different observers have different slices of spacetime they call now. This has been interpreted by many to mean that all moments in time exist equally, the block universe idea. However, it's crucial to distinguish the mathematical model from ontological reality. Relativity tells us how to calculate what different observers will label as simultaneous, or how clocks run at different speeds under motion or gravity. It does not literally show past events still existing. As philosopher of physics Dean Rickles notes, paraphrasing, physics in relativity describes how things appear from different frames, not what time is. The equations of relativity allow us to assign time coordinates to events, but coordinates are not the same as existence. Observers disagree on simultaneity, meaning they slice up the evolving present differently, but each observer still only experiences a present moment that keeps updating. No observer ever encounters the entirety of the supposed 4D block at once. Everyone only lives through events one by one. There is nothing in relativity that demands that the past remains out there once it has passed, only that different observers might disagree on the ordering of distant events. In fact, even in a block interpretation, nothing happens in the block, it just is. And yet, we clearly see things happen. We experience change. This indicates that the block view is missing an account of why we experience a moving present at all. Some physicists argue that the flow of time must be something real and fundamental, not just an illusion of perspective. Moreover, the block universe picture poses a challenge to the concept of causality. If all events, past, present and future, exist equally, then what does it mean to say one event leads to another? Causation normally implies production. The cause happens, then later the effect happens as a result. But in a block where cause and effect coexist eternally, this temporal notion of causation becomes strange. The effect is already there in the future, waiting for its cause. Some have tried to salvage the idea of causation in a block by treating it as a static relationship. The cause and effect just are, with a certain order on the block, but this robs causation of its intuitive essence, the idea that causes produce effects. In a persistent present view, by contrast, causality is straightforward. Present events cause subsequent events, which, when they occur, are the new present. The chain of cause and effect unfolds within one reality, the now, rather than being laid out to cross an already existing timeline. Deterministic physical laws, then, are not describing a fixed block of events. They are describing a process, a continually evolving reality where the present state at one moment causes the present state at the next moment, and so on. This process view is both logically and experientially compelling. It matches how we actually observe causality. We never see causes down the line before they happen. We only infer past causes from present evidence and see present causes creating immediate effects. Addressing relativity and the block universe, Einstein's relativity is often taken as evidence against the persistent present perspective. If simultaneity is relative, if different observers have different sets of events they each call now, how can we talk about the present? And if the laws of physics are symmetric in time, they don't prefer a direction, maybe time's apparent flow is just a cognitive artifact. The existential logicism stance is that relativity's empirical success can be acknowledged without granting ontological reality to the past and future. Relativity shows that there is no single global present agreed upon by all observers. It does not show that for any given observer, the past and future exist just the same as what that observer experiences now. Each observer still experiences a flow of now, and relativity's spacetime can be seen as a kind of coordinate grid laid over the present process, a grid in which different observers carve up when and where differently. In technical terms, the persistent present existential logicism principle can be made compatible with relativity if one recognizes an observer-dependent present, a perspectival version of the present, as some philosophers describe, or posits that there is an unseen preferred frame of time. Some physicists exploring quantum gravity consider the possibility of a hidden absolute time. Without delving into speculative physics, the key point is this: nothing experimentally observed forces us to conclude that the entirety of time is out there as an extended entity. All observations can be accounted for by local present moments and signals exchanging between them. The block universe is a valid interpretation of the equations, but it remains just that, an interpretation, a philosophical add-on. It is not a testable entity itself, and indeed is not a physically verified reality. We should not confuse a useful model, like drawing time as a line on paper, with the reality of what exists. The persistent present approach takes seriously the reality of temporal becoming, the coming into being of events, which the block universe, by design, erases, since in a true block, all events simply are. Dismissing our powerful impression that time flows as a mere illusion, as Einstein did, may be too hasty. It trades one mystery for another, why we feel time if it isn't real, and possibly denies a chunk of experienced reality. Science should aim to explain our experiences, not explain them away. It's worth noting that even within the physics community, there's active debate on this issue. In 2016, a conference on time in cosmology brought out sharp divisions. Some physicists made peace with the block universe as simply how the world is, while others vehemently argued that becoming is real and that the future does not exist. Ontologically, it's not there. Physicist Lee Smolin, for instance, contends that time's flow is a fundamental aspect of reality and that the block view misses something crucial about the universe's evolution. We mention this to emphasize that the persistent present view is not mere metaphysical fancy, it is a defensible view even in cutting-edge physics, albeit a minority one. And it has one strong card in its hand: it directly embraces the reality of causation and change, rather than burying it in a tenseless geometry, eliminating time paradoxes. A powerful, pragmatic argument for the persistent present worldview is how elegantly it resolves classic paradoxes and confusions about time. Take time travel paradoxes. The infamous grandfather paradox asks what happens if a time traveller goes back and prevents his own grandfather from having children, thus preventing the time traveller's own birth. In a present-centric universe, such a scenario simply cannot occur, because there is no back in time to travel to. The would-be time traveller has nowhere to go. The past isn't an actual place or timeline that exists. To even imagine true time travel, one has to smuggle in an eternalist assumption that past moments are like different locations one could visit. Remove that assumption, and the paradox evaporates. One cannot alter the past if the past is not a thing that exists. The only way one could travel in time would be to reconstruct a past state now in the present. For example, arranging matter today into the exact configuration it had a year ago. But even if one achieved that, it's not truly going back in time. It's creating a present imitation of a past state. And crucially, it would still occur after the original events, preserving the overall causal order. Meaning you could kill what looks like your grandpa in what looks like the past. But they would be neither your past or your grandfather in practice. So in short, you cannot rewind the universe. You can only create a new state that resembles an earlier state. All those science fiction paradoxes are avoided. You can't accidentally kill your own grandfather in 1900 because you will never actually find yourself in the year 1900. You remain unbreakably part of the chain of events moving forward. Determinism versus predestination. Likewise, the troubling idea of fate or predestination takes on a different light under the persistent present view. In a block universe, your future is in some sense already there, which can be a deeply discomforting notion. Do we then have any choice? Is everything set in stone? In the persistent present model, even if the world is deterministic, the future is not existent or written anywhere. It will be determined only when it happens. This nuance matters. It means the universe isn't a static sculpture, it's a live computation unfolding in real time. The outcome may be predictable in principle, but it isn't instantiated until time arrives for it. This helps us conceptually separate determinism from fatalism. Determinism means that if you knew all initial conditions and laws perfectly, you could calculate the outcome. But it doesn't mean the outcome exists already, waiting in the wings. It still has to be realized through the unfolding of causes. Thus, one can have a determined yet open future, open in the sense that it's not yet real, not yet part of reality. We as agents still have to go through the motions, and in doing so we experience making choices that affect what comes next. Implications for free will and consciousness. Free will. This brings us to the question of free will. Free will is often defined as the ability to have done otherwise, to choose among multiple possible futures. Under the persistent present existential logicism framework, the notion of alternative futures is revealed as problematic. If only the present exists, there aren't multiple futures laid out ahead, there is only one unfolding reality. In effect, the garden of forking paths, where each decision splits the timeline into different possible worlds, is not an actual feature of reality unless one entertains the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is a separate discussion. For the classical idea of free will, I could either go left or go right, completely freely. There is never more than one actual outcome, the one that comes to pass. Thus, if by free will we mean a supernatural ability to step outside of causality and pick from truly open, simultaneously real possibilities, such free will cannot exist in a consistent, persistent, present, causally governed universe. However, this does not mean our will, choices, and deliberations are meaningless or unreal. Far from it, they are crucial parts of the chain of causation. We do make decisions in the present, and those decisions are exactly the processes by which certain effects, future events come to be. The feeling of deliberation, weighing options, imagining outcomes is a real-time cognitive process that influences our actions. It's just not a magical process that steps outside of physics. As we argued earlier, denying the reality of the experience of choice is self-defeating. Any complete account of reality must include the fact that we experience choosing. The persistent present perspective aligns with this by saying, yes, we experience making choices, and that experience is happening now and has causal power now. What it denies is that there were ever genuinely two different future outcomes simultaneously available to you. Rather, there was a range of possible outcomes, and one becomes real as you choose. In principle, if we could rewind the universe, an impossible feat, but hypothetically to the exact same prior state, you would make the same choice every time. Given the same influences, because those influences, your desires, your reasoning, your character, all encoded in your brain state, are exactly what produce the choice. If some randomness is involved, say quantum indeterminacy influencing neural processes, then the outcome might vary, but that randomness isn't under your control. It's just luck, which is not what we usually mean by free will either. So either way, the traditional libertarian notion of free will, the idea of an absolute ability to have done otherwise, is illusory. We can instead keep a more modest notion. You have free will in the sense that you, your mind, your values, your intentions, are the immediate cause of some of your actions, as opposed to those actions being forced by something external to you. But you do not have free will in the sense of being able to alter the course of events that are already fully determined by the combination of your own state and the laws of nature. In a present-only reality, alternate futures have the same status as fiction, conceivable but not actual. Importantly, this view does not render our inner life irrelevant. In fact, it emphasizes our inner life as part of the causal fabric. Our choices matter enormously. They are exactly how the future gets decided. It's just that the process by which they matter is deterministic or probabilistic according to physical laws, not a whimsical freedom beyond those laws. This perspective can actually be comforting. The future isn't fixed until it happens, but when it does happen, it follows reliably from causes, including our own input. So we participate in shaping the future through our present actions. We just don't get to jump to the end and change it from outside the system. And we need not feel like helpless marionettes of fate. Our will is built into the unfolding of events as an active ingredient. Consciousness in the now. There is a deep connection between the persistent present view and consciousness. Our entire conscious existence happens in the present. We never consciously experience the past or the future. We experience memories of the past and anticipations of the future, but those are present experiences in our mind. In fact, one way to think of consciousness is as the organism's method of being intensely attuned to the present, integrating a bit of immediate memory, the very recent past, and immediate anticipation, the impending future, into what psychologists call the specious present, which is the short window of time the mind perceives as now. The brain continually refreshes this window as new sensory information comes in and old information fades out. Our sense of self is tied to the continuity of memory, but at any given instant, what you call you is essentially a pattern of information and awareness occurring in the now. This lends a phenomenological argument to the persistent present perspective. The only reality we can verify is the one we are presently aware of. Anything else, past or future, we know only by indirect means. In epistemological terms, the present is self-authenticating. It's the scene of actuality. Past and future, as far as our knowledge is concerned, are constructions from present data. This doesn't prove ontologically that only the present exists, but it suggests that postulating more like a timeless 4D block in which past and future are equally real is an extravagant addition with no direct evidence. It is more parsimonious and conceptually clear to say that reality is simply what's happening right now, continually. Consciousness, in turn, is an evolved feature that tracks this ongoing reality. It remembers enough of prior states to inform current action and projects enough of possible future states to guide decisions, all within the present moment. Science and the present. If we accept that only the present exists, how must science reconceptualize time? One immediate. Implication is that time is not a fundamental substance or backdrop, but a derived concept. We measure time by observing change clocks tick, planets orbit, particles oscillate. If hypothetically nothing changed, the concept of time would have no meaning. In the persistent present view, what we call the flow of time is just the continuous change of the universe's state. Physicist Julian Barber, who argues that time is an illusion, describes all possible moments as configurations of the universe and defines time as simply the order in which those configurations are experienced. He suggests that what exists are discrete, instantaneous configurations, he calls them nows, and the apparent flow is the correlation between them. Our view is a bit different in that we emphasize the ontological reality of a single, ever-changing now, rather than an ensemble of equally real nows. But the common thread is that time is emergent from change. If only the present is real, then statements like time is a fourth dimension of space are metaphorical at best. Instead, we'd say space is a present structure, and things change within it according to physical laws, giving rise to the notion of time. This could have ramifications in theoretical physics, for instance, quantum gravity approaches like loop quantum gravity, and even conceptual frameworks such as a hypothetical unified equilibrium field theory, UFT, often hint that time as we know it might not exist at the most fundamental level. It could be an approximation that emerges from more basic relationships. Some equations in advanced physics, like the Wheeler-DeWitt equation in quantum cosmology, even lack a time variable, suggesting a timeless formulation that must be interpreted carefully to recover a sense of flow. The persistent present perspective resonates with those hints. The flow of time might not be a basic ingredient of the universe, but rather a result of the universe's state continually changing. Another scientific angle is the second law of thermodynamics, which says entropy disorder tends to increase and thereby provides an arrow of time from past lower entropy to future higher entropy. In a persistent present universe, the second law isn't a law about things persisting from past to future, but about how each new present state tends to be more entropic than the prior state. It doesn't imply the past is still present, it simply implies a direction to the sequence of present states. In fact, it reinforces the one-way flow. You can't decrease entropy without extraordinary effort, which means you can't truly restore a past state completely. This physical irreversibility complements the philosophical point that you can't revisit the past once it's gone. No cosmic eraser, no cosmic library, the persistent present framework saves us from certain confusions. People sometimes ask, where does the past go? Or where is the future stored? These questions mistakenly treat time like space, as if past moments are places we depart from that continue to exist somewhere behind us, or future moments are locations waiting ahead. The persistent present answer is straightforward. The past doesn't go anywhere. It simply ceases to exist except for its effects in the present. The future isn't stored anywhere. It will be created as events unfold. The universe isn't like a DVD or book with all chapters already written. It's more like a real-time conversation. Once spoken, words remain only as echoes in memory or recordings. Upcoming words have yet to be invented in the speaker's mind. The now is the speaking. There is an existential poignancy to this. Each moment of our lives is truly here and then gone. This understanding encourages us to focus on the present, as many wisdom traditions urge, because that's where reality lives. It also aligns with the idea that history is not destiny. Whatever has happened, and the next moment depends on the current one, not on some immutable fate set in stone. Refuting counter-arguments. Let's recap a few common counter-arguments and see how the persistent present perspective addresses them. Objection: relativity proves all times exist. Refutation: relativity shows there's no single universal clock or present, but it doesn't prove that past and future are ontologically real things. It's entirely consistent to interpret relativity as describing how present events appear to different observers, each with their own frame of reference, without endorsing a block universe where all times exist at once. The block universe is a philosophical interpretation of relativity's mathematics, not a direct empirical fact, and many physicists and philosophers find it unsatisfactory, or at least not mandatory. Causality and our direct experience still point to an unfolding present, and nothing in relativity disproves that. Objection: the block universe is more elegant and avoids a moving now. Refutation: the static block picture indeed removes the notion of a flowing now, but it does so at the cost of making change itself illusory. It's a trade-off. One can either treat the flow of time as an illusion, the block view, or treat the existence of past and future as an illusion, the present-centric view. We choose the latter, as it does no violence to the reality of causation and experience. The block model may be mathematically neat, but it introduces a puzzling implication that nothing ever truly happens, which contradicts the fundamental nature of physical processes. In reality, things do happen. Also, if one believes physical laws are dynamic, they cause events to unfold, the block is problematic. How are laws enforced or executed if time is an already laid out tapestry? By contrast, in the persistent present view, laws are rules governing the transition from one present state to the next, which is a very natural way to think of laws, like algorithms running step by step through time. Objection. What about space-time as Minkowski described it? Refutation. We acknowledge Hermann Minkowski's famous statement that henceforth space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only. The union of the two will preserve an independent reality. This statement reflects the geometrization of time in relativity, but again, it speaks to a model of combining coordinates for calculation. In our view, what's real is not an inert 4D block, but the relationships that Minkowski's geometry encodes. Those relationships, causal connections, the light speed limit, etc., certainly constrain the sequence of present moments. For instance, relativity tells us no signal can reach certain events, except through allowed paths in spacetime. The persistent present view doesn't deny spacetime's usefulness. It denies that spacetime is a literal container of matter and events. The present isn't a slice moving through an already existing spacetime block. That metaphor fails because movement would require an external time dimension beyond spacetime. Rather, the present is the one spacetime slice that exists, and it continuously updates itself. We cannot rigorously describe that using block language because the block formalism has no provision for an updating present. But that's a limitation of the formalism, not a disproof of an updating present in reality. It may be that new physics is needed to formally represent a global present. Indeed, some proposals in quantum gravity do consider a preferred universal time frame, but that remains an open frontier. Objection, memory and historical evidence prove the past is real. Refutation, they prove the past happened, not that it's still happening. All evidence of the past exists right now, in the form of memories or records in the present. This is entirely compatible with only the present existing. We can challenge anyone to point to evidence of the past that is not an object or information in the present. It can't be done. There is zero direct evidence that past events are still out there in some form. Everything indicates they've transformed into the current state of the world. Objection, theoretical time travel, wormholes, etc. suggests the past and future are places we could visit. Refutation, even speculative physics that allows closed time-like curves, CTC, as mathematical solutions in general relativity, doesn't truly resurrect a lost past. It just creates a scenario where an event could be both in the causal future and the causal past of itself, a self-contained loop in time. Stephen Hawking strongly doubted that such scenarios are physically possible, proposing the chronology protection conjecture. The laws of physics do not allow the appearance of closed time-like curves. Essentially, physics might enforce the persistent present principle by preventing any consistency violation that true time travel would create. And even if CTCs were possible, they would be highly constrained loops, not a free license to wander a living past timeline. We lean on Hawking's authority here. Nature seems to forbid messing with causality, supporting the idea that only the forward, one-way progression of present events is real. In light of all this, we can propose a better framework for thinking about time. Instead of picturing time as a line, think of time as a spotlight. The spotlight of reality shines only on the present. It moves forward, or rather, it continuously illuminates new moments, but it never illuminates more than one moment at a time. The previous stage goes dark, it no longer exists, even though its effects persist as the conditions shaping the next moment under the spotlight. The future lies in darkness, non-existence, until the spotlight arrives there. Importantly, in this analogy, the spotlight isn't moving over a pre-existing timeline, it is creating the timeline as it progresses. The experience of time's flow is just our consciousness riding along with this moving spotlight, always located at the point of illumination, never ahead, never behind. The power of now. Embracing the persistent present worldview has profound implications. It simplifies our ontology, no mysterious past or future entities lurking out of reach. It aligns with a strict causal order, preventing paradoxes and violations, and it reframes human experience. We exist in an eternal now that is ever renewing. It also carries a philosophical lesson. Reality is always with us, right here, right now. The past is unchangeable because it's gone. The future is unwritten because it's yet to come. What we have, what being truly is this present moment and what we choose to do with it. This perspective is not only logically and scientifically grounded, but also existentially resonant. It calls us to root our understanding of the world in the immediate facts of existence, and to see time not as an external container we are trapped within, but as the logical sequence of the universe is unfolding, a sequence we ourselves are part of. By rejecting the reification of past and future, we also remove certain existential anxieties. For example, the fear that we are somehow trapped by a fixed fate or haunted by a still living past, and replace them with a focus on responsibility for the present. In the persistent present, being and becoming are one. To be real is to be present, and to become is simply the manner in which the present continually refreshes itself. The spectrum of consciousness, it's like we're all part of this deeper underlying structure, man. We're all like part of the same thing. Where's my lighter? Consciousness is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. Consciousness